So I'm going to do a review of a video game for you. So this is a review of Resident Evil Code Veronica on the SEGA Dreamcast. Now, this game was released in the year 2000. And during its early development stages, Code Veronica was known under the working title Resident Evil 3. However, due to contractual obligations with Sony that required the main series to remain on PlayStation consoles, the game was rebranded. What we know as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was originally a spin-off before taking the main series title. So this really is Resident Evil 3, and I have recently played and completed Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 on this very channel. And it all makes sense now. It all makes sense, that trivia. Because Resident Evil 3, it was designed as a spin-off, and it doesn't really feel like 1 and 2. But Veronica feels like the real third game, in my opinion. Now, the plot of this game is kind of interesting. It's kind of famous, and it's one of the interesting things about the plot is if this would never get made today, especially with ESG funds. Those ESG, those eco-social governance funds would definitely be denied to you if you put this storyline in the game. So the plot of this Resident Evil revolves around essentially Claire and Chris. So after Resident Evil 2, Chris was, is it Chris? Claire was looking for her brother Chris, and she couldn't find him. At the end of Resident Evil 2, she worked out kind of where he was, and she went off to try and find him. And so the story continues in Veronica. Claire is still looking for Chris, and the storyline in this game is so ridiculous. We're going to get to the Ashford family in a minute, but I have to say this. So the game starts off. This is after a thermonuclear warhead was dropped on Raccoon City from the original Resident Evil. So the government are aware that there's a serious incident to the point where they dropped a nuclear warhead on their own soil. That is how much of a threat Umbrella Corporation are to the world. Bear in mind, France is one of America's allies. At the beginning of this game, after that happened, there is still a giant 50-story umbrella skyscraper in the heart of France. So how they're still allowed to operate, I don't know. But if anyone had forgotten about this giant umbrella terrorist skyscraper in the middle of France, then they surely would have been reminded of it when at the beginning of Code Veronica, a chopper with a Gatling gun, presumably part of Umbrella's illegal paramilitary, unloads a full clip into their own headquarters in order to kill Claire. But somehow everyone's just allowing Umbrella to operate despite all of this. So it's the plot is beyond ridiculous, but I love it. So you got Claire and Chris. Chris shows up halfway through, you get to play as him, and then it goes back to Claire, and then it ends with Chris again. So the plot of this game explains where Umbrella Corporation came from, the main evil corporation that was made famous by the original Resident Evil. And the Umbrella Corporation was created by a group of people, one of which was the Ashford family. And they all kind of collaborated to make Umbrella, and they were all working on the famous virus, the T virus, that changes people into zombies. So according to Wikipedia, Claire is imprisoned on Rockfort Island, a prison complex owned by Umbrella, situated in the Southern Ocean. And that place, Rockfort Island, seems to be where the Ashford family, who are essentially responsible for creating Umbrella, is situated. So there's various members of the Ashford family, and you get introduced for them. But the most interesting ones are Alfred and Alexia. So Alfred is the surviving member of this evil Ashford family, and Alexia is his twin. And they find out, this plot is so crazy, that their dad created them essentially as part of the virus, as an experiment. They were pissed off with their dad, so they injected him with the new virus in this game. I can't remember what it's called, the Veronica virus, let's just call it. And so they turned their dad into a character that has been christened Nosferatu by the fans. So he's one of the enemies in the game, and he's like a prototype tyrant. Now, Alfred, the whole family, the Ashford family, kind of explain why Resident Evil has this insane mansions that are very old style and kind of they have ornate designs and very opulent. It's because the people who were responsible for creating Umbrella, partly responsible, the Ashford family, they were part of the British nobility. So you've got all this kind of British historical symbolism and aesthetic everywhere. So that kind of explains why the Resident Evil mansion might be like it is. It's the Spencer mansion, and Spencer, who created that mansion, essentially collaborated with the Ashford family. So this explains why you've got all this elaborate shit that's just made by these rich British noble psychopaths. So that was kind of interesting. And Alfred, the surviving member of the Ashford family, who's essentially turned his dad into Nosferatu, is part of this set of twins who were clones. And his sister, Alexia, who's the genius of the family, she realized after injecting their dad with this serum that the serum, although she wants to inject herself with it, it's too dangerous because she'll turn into a fucking freak like Nosferatu, her dad. So she decides to inject herself, then put herself into cryo sleep for 15 years so that she won't rapidly turn into some horrible Nosferatu freak who's constantly living in more pain than even Darth Vader himself and can kind of control the virus. So in this game, they introduced the themes of being able to control the virus. So Alfred, when his sister's asleep, he's not as smart as her, and he descends into madness. And this is the point when you get exiled to his island, and he's turned into this ruthless dictator who's a sadist and just loves hurting people and abusing people. But he's also turned into a cross-dresser. So you think Alexia is alive and running around, but it's actually him, and he puts on makeup and women's clothes, and he changes his voice and stuff. So this is the story of Resident Evil. And then you've got to find your brother, who's essentially on the trail of Umbrella and has gone to this island, and you've got to escape from the island as well, and take out the Ashford family. So that's the plot. It's fucking insane, but it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. It's like a slightly sillier version of the original Resident Evil. And the characters in this are Claire and Chris. You've also got a new character. And the new character, his name is Steve. And Steve is all kinds of ridiculous. I'm just going to play some Resident Evil footage for you here so you can kind of see what the game looks like. This is from our play session yesterday. Actually, do you know what? I've got some footage of Steve. Rather than explain how funny this character is and how silly new character Steve is, I'm just going to show you a clip from the game. And I've got to be honest, Steve, he kind of ruins this game. He's just so stupid. It takes you out of the moment and you can't suspend your disbelief. You're just looking at it, questioning some of the design choices of this game. So this is Steve, one of the main new characters in Resident Evil Code Veronica. Wait for it.
Oh yeah, that felt good. Don't worry, Claire. Your knight in shining armor is here.
You wish. But thanks for the help.
See? This is why you need me. I got your back.
Whatever. Here. Take these.
Machine guns? For me?
You know the deal, in exchange for your Lugers.
Okay.
I mean, he's such a ridiculous character. He's obviously inspired by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he's so effeminate and camp. He's wearing this choker as well. And it kind of makes sense because out in Japan, they have these areas, for example, Shinjuku, where they have hosts who are these guys who women pay loads of money to have a conversation with, and then they pop champagne with them and stuff. And they essentially look exactly like women, and they're so slender, and they're so camp all the time. You just wonder, like, how could any woman be attracted to that? But they make fucking like tens of thousands of dollars a month, the top host. So Steve is kind of like a Japanese host, but an American version. He's such a silly character. So it kind of ruins the game a bit. Every time he's on the screen, it's so ridiculous. But he's so silly that he's kind of endearing a little bit. It's just funny. It's just funny watching Steve do his thing. So he's one of the new characters, and he's camper than a Pride Month camping trip sponsored by Bud Light. Other new characters in this game, or other characters, are Albert Wesker, of course, one of the main protagonists from the Resident Evil series, is back, and I'm a big fan of Albert Wesker. A lot of people love him, myself included. I have to say that Steve is insanely OP. He goes around like kicking everyone's ass in cavalier fashion, and he's also kind of a rapist. So there's a scene where Claire is asleep or incapacitated, and he starts to go to kiss her. There's been no romantic connection between them at all at this point, and he starts to go to kiss her, and when she wakes up, he's visibly disappointed and shakes his head and tuts. So Steve is a bit rapey as well. And Steve crashes a crane because he's staring at Claire's ass, which essentially nearly kills us and makes it much harder to escape the island. So Steve is just a fucking mess. And my favorite scene with Steve is where he has to kill his father, who's turned into a zombie, but it's unintentionally hilarious, and I could not stop cracking up during that scene. And of course, Alexia, the Ashford family member, the twin sister clone of Alfred, she's also part of the game. She wakes up at some point and comes to get you. As for the enemies, the hunters are back. The hunters are always in video games, man. They are perennial menace, a thorn in your side. The hunters are really cunty in this game. I'm not sure which is harder, the hunters in the first game or the fourth game, which was supposed to be the third game, but it's chronologically the fourth game. The second, they weren't in Resident Evil 2. They were replaced by the Lickers, who weren't as bad. In Resident Evil 3, they came back, but at the end of the game, you had these sick guns in this one scene, and they weren't that much of a threat. I think the hunters in Resident Evil 1, there was such a lack of mobility, you'd often get stuck in the corner and they destroy you, but the hunters in this game are so fucking OP. I call them Pepes, bruv. And yeah, Pepe, there's a purple Pepe in this game. So there's a poisoned hunter and they're purple. So the amount of damage they do is insane. If you're on caution, which is one below being fine, where your health bar is yellow, one jumping swipe from a hunter can kill you immediately. So the hunters come back, the Pepes are back. There's a new enemy, I can't remember the name, but I call it the Clonker. I should call it the Slapper because they kind of slap you, but they're like Stretch Armstrong. They are one of the most OP early game enemies in the history of Resident Evil. They kind of look like the Living Dead zombie that comes out of that that waste canister in the movie Living Dead that goes brains. They're all horrible looking and they're big. They're yellow and diseased, and they got these huge arms that stretch across the screen. So the range is amazing. They take off loads of health, and they are bullet sponges. I tried to kill it with a pistol. It took something like 30 shots. These things are insane. And at the beginning of the game, they pepper the environment with these things. I call them clonkers. And yeah, as I said, they're the hardest early game enemy in Resident Evil up until this point. They're ridiculous enemies. There's spiders in this one. The spiders in this game are way more dangerous than the first game and the second game. So the first or second, they weren't really that much of a threat. In this one, they take like 4 or 5 shotgun blasts. They're way harder, and they're kind of what the spiders always should have been like in Resident Evil. As far as bosses go, you've got Nosferatu, the dad of the clones, Alexia and Alfred. He kind of looks like Voldo from Soul Calibur, and he's a prototype tyrant. You've got a big spider boss, this big dirty spider. It's easy to kill, but the cutscene where it attacks you is really cool. Steve, spoiler later on, he gets injected with the virus by, I believe, Alexia when he's kidnapped along with Claire. And he turns into the unincredible Hulk. So he turns on you, and he's been loving you the whole game. Claire is his love interest, but at the end of the game, he tries to kill her. This boss is insane. It is the toughest boss in probably in the history of Resident Evil. So tough, you actually can't even kill it. So I unloaded 14 magnum shots into this thing, and it couldn't put it to sleep. So I realized eventually that you have to run away from this thing, but it will 2 hits will take you out. It will kill you with no problems at all. And yeah, it's one of the hardest enemies I've ever seen in Resident Evil. Steve, the unincredible Hulk. What an absolute horrible enemy. I'm trying to find it here now. I think yes, at this point we'll kind of leave it running. You're going to see him at some point. So yeah, that's one of the bosses, and yeah, that's pretty much it for the enemies and the bosses. As for the graphics, they're not too bad. I think they kind of hold up pretty well. The camera is kind of updated. So in the previous Resident Evil games, it was all fixed camera angles. But now that while they're fixed, they kind of move around. So the camera will kind of follow you down certain corridors and passageways, which is quite nice. The lighting is quite good. The facial expressions are quite good. I think it holds up pretty well. But obviously, compared to modern games, it's like night and day. Now, as for the gameplay of Resident Evil Code Veronica, it's typical Resident Evil affair. Action, puzzles, and dodging zombies. A nice array of weapons as usual. You've got the bowgun in this one, but the new thing about the bowgun in Resident Evil Code Veronica is you can get flame arrows. And I didn't realize this until after I had finished the game, but apparently that's the most OP weapon because its rate of fire is insane. Pam, 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 pam. And it has a really high damage. So apparently you can melt the last boss in about 5 seconds if you use that. So you've got the bowgun, but if you don't use the flaming bolts, it's very weak on its own, and often you get into trouble with it. Chris has got an AK, which is very cool. That served me very well towards the end of the game. The classic Magnum, the Maggers, the white chocolate Maggers is in the game as well. It's the Magnum in this game is probably the best incarnation of the Magnum when taking into account the prequels, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3. It kills a Pepe in one hit. That's what I always wanted. In Resident Evil 1, if you shoot a Pepe, a hunter, with the Magnum, sometimes it doesn't kill it in one, and I thought that was kind of bullshit. So the Magnum is decent. And of course, the shotgun returns. The shotgun is not as satisfying as the original games. The original games, the head would explode in a shower of gore when you shot it. But the shotgun in this one is slightly less satisfying, but it is no less effective. It's very, very useful. The grenade launcher is back. Grenade them, I call it. Captain Grenade him, you can call me when I get the grenade launcher. Now, this game kind of fucks you with the weapons. So it does something which is a bad design choice. Now, towards the end of the game, you switch to Chris from Claire for a very large section. Then you switch back to Claire to kill the unincredible Hulk version of Steve. And then you switch back to Chris. It doesn't tell you when you're going to switch to Chris. Now, if you put your weapons in the trunk, the famous trunk in the Resident Evil series that you can store your weapons in, and there's various trunks around the world, and the trunk somehow teleports your weapons between one another. If you don't put any good weapons in the trunk, then with Claire, you're kind of stuck with these basic weapons. The game doesn't tell you this is about to happen. So the only way you can know it is by playing through it or by checking out a guide. So this is kind of insane. I built up all this grenade ammo, which I never even used, like 40 bullets. That could have got me through like at least a third of the game. I built up all this grenade ammo, and then in the end, you can't even fucking use it because Claire has the grenade launcher, and then it goes from Claire to Chris to Claire to Chris, and the last time it goes from Claire to Chris, you don't know when it's going to swap back to the other character. So I left the grenade launcher with Claire, and so she's got it, and I can't use it on the last boss. So that is fucking insane. The fact that the game won't tell you that you're going to change to a character and you should store the weapons in the trunk so they can use them is fucking nuts. They should have just coded it so each character has their own kind of weapons that they can use irrespective of one another. So I was reading some stuff online that people can essentially break the game by putting all the good weapons with Claire, and then when it changes back to Chris, you're kind of stuck with these shitty weapons. And at the end of the game, when it's dovetailing between Chris and Claire, there's no save point for a really fucking long time. So if you get stuck for weapons or whatever, or you got the wrong choice, you have to go back so fucking far to kind of to rejig the game and put the good weapons in the trunk and stuff like that. So yeah, the weapons in the game are pretty good, but the unfortunate thing is it's the way that you have to split them up between the two characters. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of this review, shall we? The music. Now, the music is great in this game. It's actually one of the best soundtracks, Resident Evil soundtracks, of all of them I've ever heard. At one point in the first half of the game, I was saying this could be as good as the first Resident Evil. It really is that high caliber. It's very haunting. You've got the classic Resident Evil strings, and you've got these kind of ambient synth arpeggiators. So there's some electronic parts to it. And when certain enemies come in, it triggers the soundtrack, which is just really intense. When those clonkers or slappers come in, those Stretch Armstrong enemies, the soundtrack is fucking terrifying, and it's scarier than than Resident Evil Nemesis, which had a really kind of scary theme. Whenever the Nemesis, the big guy who was out to get you, would ever kind of show his face, it was scarier than that. So it's amazing. And there's a really spooky house on a hill, which is a homage to Psycho. And when you go in there, the music is so spooky, it put shivers down my spine. I was playing it and just thinking, wow, this music is incredible. In the second half of the game, I wasn't as impressed by the music, but it really is amazing. I think it's underrated, the soundtrack for Resident Evil Code Veronica. So I would recommend to go and check it out if you haven't. Love the sound in this. Love the music. Really, really fucking good. As for the puzzles, some of the hardest puzzle games ever in Resident Evil are in this version of Resident Evil Code Veronica. It actually has the hardest puzzle I've ever experienced in a Resident Evil game, and it is the picture puzzle, or the portrait puzzle. There's all these portraits on the walls, and then you have this bunch of information about the family lineage. The portraits are of different members of the Ashford family, and in order to progress through the game, you have to push a switch underneath all of them. I think there's about 10 to 12 pictures, so the amount of combinations you could do is insane. It's like the same as an ATM, so you basically can't guess it. And despite what some of the clowns on Reddit say, the logic for this puzzle, well, there is no logic for it. There's very little logic for this puzzle. If you follow the instructions logically, you can't solve it. So you have to kind of go outside of the logic and play around with it a bit randomly in order to solve this puzzle. The portrait puzzle was mad difficult. So that was hard. There's also a puzzle which you can see here where you get this crystal ball, and inside it is this key card that you need, and then there's this weird thing that's crusher. It's like a crusher. It's a huge wood stone block, and it's attached to a chain. And see, there it is. There, it keeps going up and down. Now, originally, I tried to put the crystal ball in the crusher from outside the range of the crusher. Obviously, you don't want to go under it, right? A normal human would just roll the ball or carefully place it under it from outside the range of the crusher. But no, you have to walk into the middle of the range of the crusher in order to place the crystal ball and get the card. So that was a ridiculous puzzle, and someone actually helped me out with that. Someone helped me out with it, one of the viewers who was watching the stream, which I actually kind of appreciate, because that could have taken me ages. But generally, the puzzles in this are pretty difficult, and I'd have to say I love the puzzles of Resident Evil, even though I scream in frustration when I'm usually playing these games on a live stream. It adds a really nice dynamic to the game, because Resident Evil is all about brute force. It's about just fucking like brute forcing your way through all these horrible hordes of zombies, like blowing up their heads, exploding them with rocket launchers, all that kind of shit. But you can't brute force the puzzle. So it's such a nice dynamic. You go from brute force ballistic combat to like brain teaser and taking your time a little bit and taking a breather. So that adds a really nice dynamic to the gameplay, and I really did enjoy that. So I was kind of hooked towards the end of the game. The latter half, I didn't want to put it down. I stayed up past my bedtime a bit, which is one of the reasons I look so tired today. Didn't want to put it down. It feels this now that Steve has fucked off, the game has improved and it feels a bit more serious and dark. And I like dark experiences and dark music and dark video games. And this gets pretty dark towards the end. A different version of this came out called Code Veronica X for PlayStation 2. And they added a bunch of cutscenes with Wesker to develop the story. And I watched it after I finished the game. And I would say, if you do play Code Veronica, play Code Veronica X, because the extra cutscenes with Wesker make the game make much more sense and gives you another bad guy to kind of hate, who's charming, who you love to hate. And Wesker disappears for a massive chunk of the game, which is a little bit strange. So I can understand why they added scenes with Wesker. I mean, everyone loves Wesker. He just looks cool. He's kind of camp. He's got a British accent. He's such a bastard, and he's so OP. Mentioning that makes me realize some of the continuity errors in this game. So Wesker is mad OP. He teleports across the room like in the Matrix and casually throws you across the room like it's nothing, nearly breaking your spine. And when he comes up against Alexia, the main antagonist of this game, this is the Unincredible Hulk. If you're watching, this is when Steve turns. Alexia is more powerful than Wesker, but Wesker is so fucking fast. He should be able to dodge Alexia with ease. She kind of walks around slowly initially when they meet. Wesker is trying to get hold of Alexia because Alexia is one of the only living, is pretty much the only source of this virus, this new strain of virus, and he wants to get it from her body. So they have a little fight. The bad guys start having a fight, Wesker and Alexia, and she just fucking destroys Wesker. And I'm thinking, how the fuck is she destroying him so much when he's so OP? That didn't make sense. And this scene when Steve turns into the Hulk, Alexia is morphing into this giant kind of penis monster. Japanese do like a tentacle. You can see Alexia now is this giant worm that kind of flies around. It doesn't make any sense. But this worm that you're seeing there, it has slapped me about. It's hit me about 20 times in the game. It barely takes off any health. But versus this guy, the Unincredible Hulk, Steve, it just gives him one little slap to the belly and he's instantly dead. And he's the hardest motherfucker in the history of Resident Evil. Look at this. Like with a blunt stump, just pokes him in the stomach and he's dead. But that thing, which is Alexia, had been slapping me around. So there are weird continuity errors in this, but it is Resident Evil, so you shouldn't take it too seriously. The game is massively influenced by Terminator 2 and Aliens. The opening scene where Claire is running from Umbrella, the chopper, the teal and orange, the blue kind of hue of it, all that stuff. There's a scene where Claire is pinned to the wall with this kind of secreted resin. That's very reminiscent of Aliens, where the aliens and xenomorphs will encrust you in this stuff in order to impregnate you via the facehuggers. There's also influences from The Thing. Obviously, a lot of the creatures in this look like something from The Thing, a classic movie, and it's also set in the Arctic, half of it. So I do like the themes of Terminator 2, Aliens, and The Thing. At this point, even in the early 2000s, movies and intellectual property was still being massively influenced by Aliens and Terminator 2. Halo being another one, right? That was hugely influenced by Aliens. So I do like those kind of themes. There's nothing really that new here. If you played Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, it still has tank controls. It has similar characters. Speaking of which, it's let down by Steve, but Alfred and Alexia are kind of fun. The themes are infection, body horror, claustrophobia, limited resources. They're all here. But yeah, there's nothing really new other than the kind of cross-dressing in this game, which is highly amusing. The music is brilliant. The graphics hold up fairly well. There's quite a lot of jump scares in it. And it's the first Resident Evil to have fully 3D environments. And it was the first Resident Evil on a non-Sony console. It continued the story arc. So if you're a fan of the series, obviously this is something you should play. If you've never played a Resident Evil game before, you're probably going to wonder what the hell is going on when you play this. It's going to be a bit confusing. Someone said the storyline was batshit crazy, and it kind of is, but it wasn't as difficult to follow as I thought it would be. And it just looks kind of cool. Like, look at the design of this. This is part of the Ashford family mansion. And it looks a little bit like the Spencer Mansion from the original Resident Evil. The design of it looks really cool. So if you play Resident Evil before, you like the originals, you're going to like this. If you've never played Resident Evil before, you might either love it or you might just be baffled by it. Me personally, I love Resident Evil. I've enjoyed it since the first game. So this was very enjoyable for me, especially the latter half of the game, as I said. I probably won't be playing it again. So I would give it an 8 out of 10. Maybe it should be a 7.5, but I would say an 8. A lot of the morning games I played recently didn't really have as much of an effect on me. I didn't really read about the lore or go back and watch videos about them. So it's from a different time, maybe a better time, a silly time, a fun time, a brutal time, a gory time, a bloody time. And I'm glad I played it. 8 out of 10. What do you think? Anyone else out there played this game? Do you agree with my rating? I think it's pretty fair, to be honest. I think it's kind of hard to argue with. I think if you go back and want to replay it again and again, you could give it a 9. But I think once this is done, you'll put it to bed. So there you go. My review of Code Veronica.